Insanity at Stamford Bridge as the battle between Poch's Blues and Pep's Blues ended 4-4 in a crazy, reckless encounter. The XG shows just how open this game was, but let's not waste any time and dive straight into the tactics used by Poch and Pep, starting with City on the ball. One of the main reasons City looks so sloppy is they built with that uber wide back three that we saw perform poorly against United, but today it was actually punished. The formation's width made it easier for Chelsea to isolate City's defenders during the press, often forcing them backwards or into risky infield passes, as the distances between the centre-backs simply made combination play difficult. And just like in the Manchester derby, what this meant is that whenever there was a transition for Chelsea, it was not only an instant 1 versus 1 for the wingers against the fullbacks, but it also created massive gaps between the City centre-back and the wide fullback that Chelsea's wingers could look to attack directly. Or if City's men contracted to try and close those gaps instead, now the winger was primed to receive and face his man, something that neither Palmer nor Sterling were afraid to do, and we saw them cause City all sorts of problems. But Chelsea's defense was intelligent, and they did not always recklessly throw themselves into the press at inopportune moments. Instead, they focused on City's midfield, knowing that their midfield box would be a cause of major issues, as they could potentially create a 4 versus 3 against Chelsea's midfield. So, with Gallagher and Jackson marking the central midfielders instead, and Palmer aiding in central defense by tucking in from the flank, so much that he was barely a winger, Chelsea were able to even up the numbers. This approach effectively stymied City's attempts to penetrate through the middle, forcing them to explore alternative attacking routes. Gallagher in particular was a nightmare, as he could sit on a pivot initially and still spring into a press whilst covering the angle into the midfield, so effectively he was marking 2 men at once. But by being patient on the ball, eventually City would be able to draw out Jackson from the rest defense, and he was nowhere near as effective a presser as Gallagher. And now, with the Chelsea man high, this would create spaces in the midfield, meaning that the role of Palmer defensively would now be emphasized. With Palmer often tucked in, Silva identified the opportunity on the flanks to push wider left into this position that would draw the attention of all 3 of these men. If it was Caicedo that moved wide, there was room for Haaland to drop into, as Alvarez kept Fernandes occupied. But in general, Caicedo was hesitant to push that wide, and we instead saw him either stay deep or push higher onto Akanji or Rodri to apply the pressure. Palmer, slightly higher up, was facing a similar dilemma of whether to push onto Gvardiol out wide or tuck in onto the pivot. And either way, whichever scenario he chose, we saw Silva push right up into the left-hand half space, and it would mean that City could still easily create 2 versus 1s against James, who did well to hold his own for the most part. But the 3 versus 2s still meant that City were always able to work their way into dangerous positions down the left, usually culminating in Doku and Bernardo combining, with the half-space runner looking to attack the Chelsea box time and again, or Doku getting into 1 versus 1 zones. Chelsea were struggling down their right, and recognizing the need for change, Pochettino swapped Palmer and Gallagher, maximizing Gallagher's energy and pressing ability in the 3 versus 2s to have more solidity as he could cover more ground. This change was significant in disrupting City's builder play and exerting more control in the midfield. City similarly had success down the right, and where Chelsea defended with Palmer narrow, their opposing winger Sterling stayed high on his man in Walker, ready to either pressure him or transition behind him. But now, in instances where City broke Chelsea's first line of defense, Alvarez frequently found space to operate in, and this could draw in Cucurella and free the wide pass into Foden. Foden's matchup against Cucurella was particularly crucial, as he created several dangerous situations for City, either directly or when Fernandes was drawn higher up into the pivot, Alvarez would be free to receive and then make the run into the half space, which we saw repeatedly as he looked to get the cross in. But Chelsea themselves were more than dangerous in possession, so what did they look to do tactically? Chelsea's deep play was fascinating, beginning from the goal kick, where they had options. Thiago Silva could begin wider, more like a traditional centre-back, and in this space City were ready to press centrally, led by Haaland and Alvarez, with Foden ready to push onto Cucurella. So instead, with the centre relatively well protected, Fernandes spotted the chance to get space away from the crowded centre, with Cucurella pushing higher and creating space for Enzo to receive. So this movement opened up space for Fernandes to initiate plays from deeper positions on the left, leveraging his ability to handle pressure and begin build-up much better than Cucurella, forcing City to come across and potentially open up more space higher in the midfield in these situations, and potentially break the press. But Cucurella could also begin much deeper, becoming the left centre-back himself. When he positioned himself deeper, Silva often assumed a pivot role, either alongside Caicedo, with Fernandes seeking space wide on the left. At times this setup also saw Fernandes in a pivot role, with Caicedo pushing up, and occasionally Reece James inverting into this position. The objective was to establish a double pivot to counter City's press, which often focused on pivot-to-pivot marking, meaning if both Rodri and Bernardo were drawn high, all of a sudden there was plenty of room between the lines. This approach was instrumental, and Chelsea consistently cut through City's midfield like a knife through butter. Higher up as well, Chelsea had success. In the first half, City were better, defending in more of a 4-1-4-1, meaning the pressing onus was on Alvarez and Bernardo on the pivot, and Rodri could still patrol this space behind them. With James pushing high to become the right winger, Palmer could begin higher to create a box for Chelsea. But Palmer also saw a way to alleviate the pressure deeper, by dropping in temporarily to make it a 3 versus 2 against the higher pressing City men. But as the game progressed, and in the second half in particular, City were now pressing in a flatter 4-4-2, with Alvarez alongside Haaland, as they looked to rush the Chelsea centre-backs. But this did not go well for the citizens. Now, Rodri was the man backing up the pivot-to-pivot press, meaning that Sterling and Palmer in particular had acres of space to pick up the ball between the lines, and this led to several dangerous situations that City were lucky to get away with. This match was pure chaos, and from an entertainment point of view, as well as a mentality point of view, both these sides earn a 10 out of 10. But looking at the actual performance and tactical plans, this is different, as both sides had clear weaknesses, with Pep persisting with his wide back 3 that left them looking vulnerable, meaning he only earns a 5. Chelsea struggled to deal with the left side overload, putting a lot of pressure on Reece James, but I still thought they were the unluckier of the two sides, and Poch earns a 6. Not everything was covered in this analysis, so drop anything else you noticed down below. This match was a departure from what made City so successful last season, so if you want to see how Pep achieved tactical perfection, click on the video on screen now. Or if you're more interested in his battle with his greatest nemesis Mourinho, click on this video here. The choice is yours.